There are several different ways in which the Roman Catholic Church engages with modernity. And in order to understand this engagement, we ought to look at how European states that began to emerge and embrace democratic and republican forms of government interacted with the papacy itself. And the real major actor here is France. Um, the French Revolution occurs, and Pope Pius VI emerges as a real opponent of the ideals of the French Revolution. Part of what happens here is that the new French Republican government really seeks to weaken the role and influence of the papacy and of the French Roman Catholic Church. This was one of the big points of contention during the Revolutionary era itself. So part of what happens is that French bishops are compelled to swear loyalty to the state. French bishops are seen as more loyal to the papacy than to the French Republic itself. Uh, the French Republic tries to pass laws to force bishops to be elected to their positions and not appointed by the papacy. This is in part because there were significant land holdings and other financial holdings that bishops held that the French Republic wanted to rein in. They wanted to rein in the social influence of Roman Catholicism itself. And so part of the effort to reining in is also that there is an abolition of tithes being paid to churches. That is revenue off of especially agricultural production. That revenue can no longer be directed to churches. Many monasteries are abolished and demolished, and church property is put under state control. You might observe that a lot of this sounds very similar to what Henry VIII does during his time as monarch in England. So there was this real fear of France emerging as an enemy to the papacy. And this really comes to fruition when the French army itself captures Rome in 1798, and Paul VI dies as a virtual prisoner in Rome in 1799. So this encounter with a manifestation of liberal democracy, a production of modernity, really turns Roman Catholicism in its official forms in Europe away from experiments with modernity. And so we have culminates in 1846 when Pope Pius IX is elected, and he has a very long papacy up until 1878. And he really emerges as an anti-modern pope. He really invests a lot of energy in resisting modernity in all of its manifestations. Early on, 3 years after he becomes pope in 1849, the Republic of Rome is declared. This is, again, another exercise in liberal republican democracy. This is a time period where Italy itself is coalescing as a nation state instead of a collection of smaller regional states. The Pope had overseen much of Rome and of the papal states around it. Initially, Pius IX appears to be open to some aspects of modernity, but the creation of the Republic of Rome and the seizure of papal property causes Pius to flee Rome for a period of time and really turns him against liberalism in its political forms. This all culminates in 1870 with the formal creation of the Kingdom of Italy, and then the seizure of the papal states around Rome. And this leaves the papacy only with a scattering of palaces that it has, especially the Vatican Palace. And so the Vatican is reconstituted as the only remaining papal state. And so essentially you have all of the capital of Italy, Rome, surrounding this one island of the papal states left, the Vatican. And so if you've ever been to Rome, you can imagine in your mind what that geography looks like and feels like. What we have then over the course of the papacy then of Pius IX is this real resistance to the modernity and these experiments in democracy and republicanism. It begins to be seen as antithetical to the interests of the church. This culminates in many ways with the First Vatican Council, which is held, as you can tell, at this papal state in the Vatican. And here, the real issue that is being dealt with is papal authority. And what is the nature of papal authority? And specifically, when does the church speak without error? And can the Pope declare doctrines without error or infallibly? The notion of papal infallibility had been a doctrine that had been developing over several centuries. And by this point in time, most bishops in the Roman Catholic Church hold that the Pope is infallible when speaking on behalf of the church. But the question is how? Like, in what capacity? What sets up the parameters for papal infallibility? And this is all crystallized in a document from the First Vatican Council, Pastor Aeternus, which means the eternal shepherd. And the council promulgates the doctrine of papal infallibility in this text. And I would like to read the conclusion of the text so we can get a sense of how they're defining papal infallibility. So this is in the last section 4, the final paragraph 9. It reads, "Therefore, faithfully adhering to the tradition received from the beginning of the Christian faith, to the glory of God our Savior, for the exaltation of the Catholic religion and the salvation of the Christian people, with the approval of the Sacred Council, we teach and define." So, okay, just one thing about reading Roman Catholic conciliar documents. Whenever a word like therefore appears, you want to pay attention because something definitive is being taught. And then when we get to this phrase, we teach and define, you really ought to slow down and pay real attention to what comes next, because that is the core of the teaching that's emerging. So the council is saying we're teaching and defining as a divinely revealed dogma, so that is as a core teaching that comes from God, that when the Roman pontiff, that's the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, speaks ex cathedra, so that word, that Latin word ex cathedra means from the chair, as from the chair of Peter. So they go on to explain. That is when, in the exercise of his office as shepherd and teacher of all Christians, in virtue of his supreme apostolic authority. So, there is infallible teaching happening when the Pope is exercising a specific office, that is, as the successor of Peter, to attend to the universal needs of the church. So when he's doing this and he defines a doctrine concerning faith or morals to be held by the whole church, so in very specific contexts, when there is a point of doctrine or moral teaching that everyone needs to attend to and affirm, what happens next? He possesses, the Pope, by the divine assistance promised to him in Blessed Peter. So when Christ says to Peter, "You are Peter, and upon this rock I'll build my church, and you'll have keys that by which you bind or loose in heaven and earth, all authority rests with you." So when he's acting in his role as the successor of Peter, and he's teaching these core doctrines on faith or morals, when he's doing this for the whole church, then that infallibility which the divine Redeemer willed his church to enjoy in defining doctrine concerning faith or morals. So there is a infallible teaching that occurs within this very special set of circumstances. And therefore, such definitions of the Roman Pontiff are of themselves and not by the consent of the church irreformable. That is, this is a teaching that the Pope himself delivers that cannot be reversed even by a council of the church. So I hope you're grasping how really significant this statement of papal infallibility is. It's not to create a new doctrine per se, but as is said elsewhere, to expound the revelation or deposit of faith delivered through the apostles. This is elsewhere in chapter 4. And to keep the church from error. So the idea is that he is articulating a teaching that's already implicit in the apostolic tradition, but is foregrounding it or refining it or clarifying it in some significant way. And so this kind of infallibility that we call papal infallibility is really defined as the infallibility of the extraordinary magisterium. Now remember, magisterium means the teaching tradition of the church. An extraordinary magisterium then is when a specific teaching in the church is made that is a point of further expansion or clarification of doctrine that only the Pope can deliver. Now, what's important to understand is that, as far as we can tell with Roman Catholic teaching, papal infallibility has only been used once. It's only been invoked once. In 1950, with a declaration of the Assumption of the Virgin Mary as a doctrine of the Church, which actually the Assumption of the Virgin Mary was a long-held devotional practice and understanding that the Pope expounds upon, says, yes, this is a divinely revealed dogma, and thus ought to be infallibly held. There have been other moments in which infallibility has been invoked, especially in the papacy of Pope John Paul II concerning the ordination of male priests and the exclusion of female priests or women to the order of priests. But scholars of Roman Catholic ecclesiology understand that to be a statement of the infallibility of the ordinary magisterium. That is, that this was something that was already infallibly held. John Paul II was merely reiterating what was already taught. So as we look at the First Vatican Council, then we can also see with that final statement about, only the Pope can declare this, and there can be no kind of irreformability of it or appeal to a council. This is really the final defeat of the notion of conciliarism in Roman Catholicism, or that a council of the church can operate equally to the office of the papacy. So with both the rejection of conciliarism, we can see that as an ecclesiastical version of the rejection of liberal democracy that's emerging in continental Europe. That both of them have this notion of a representational body that then can challenge the authority of a singular figure, whether a pope or a monarch. So this is one form of response to modernity. Another feature of modernity is the way in which it brings about economic upheaval for the sake of social progress. So we think about factories that reconfigure social life and can create conditions of poverty for laborers, but great wealth for manufacturers. And the Roman Catholic Church becomes very concerned with the disruptions that economic change in the context of modernity is bringing to the faithful. So Pope Leo the 13th, who is a successor to Pope Pius IX, he comes right on his heels, really is supportive of the Roman Catholic Church engaging in social reform and rejects the emphasis on individual liberties that seem to say the most important thing for an individual to do is to earn as much wealth as possible. That kind of atomizing of the individual that leads to the economic exploitation of other individuals, Leo sees as a really harmful aspect of modernity and wants to push against it. And so he composes a papal bull, a declaration of papal teaching known as Rerum Novarum, which is intended to guide Roman Catholic reformers to deal with the harmful effects of capitalism and to guide the faithful away from embracing socialism, especially communism or Marxism, which were atheistic and really said spiritual reality does not exist. The only reality that exists is material reality. And so that's, again, another production of modernity. Both Marxism and capitalism, both are harmful economic agents as far as the papacy is concerned. And so Rerum Novarum is attempting to reflect on the problem of economic disruption and what are the rights, responsibilities, and duties of both the workers and the employers. So I just want to offer a little summary of what happens in Rerum Novarum, which we also had as a class reading. So it begins with stating the problem of economic changes that leads working class people vulnerable to economic exploitation and really harmful physical and social effects. And so people are in need of the state to aid them. But the church says we have a role to arbitrate with the state about how to deal with conflicts that emerge between labor and capital, between the working class and the elites. If the state alone doesn't have the solution, the church has a gospel vision that can also contribute. And then Rerum Novarum in chapter 20 goes on to lay out these duties that each group has to each other. So the duty of workers, of laborers, are several. One is to fully and freely perform the agreed upon work. Another is not to injure or outrage an employer or to harm property. So sabotage was a very common labor agitation tactic. And so, you shouldn't be destroying the works of the machinery in order to make your point about fair pay. Also, not to give in to agitators. Strikes are becoming common. Labor violence becomes very common. In the late 19th century, there's a significant history of labor violence at the United States in places like Chicago with the Haymarket riot. There's riots among miners in places like Kentucky and Ohio and Pennsylvania. This social disruption and social violence is a real concern for the church. On the other hand, Rerum Novarum makes clear that the wealthy and employers have really significant duties themselves. So the respect of each employee is a full person, not a student. So here we see the emergence of the concept of human dignity, really driving Catholic social teaching here. There should not be an expectation that people are simply objects that exist to further the economic gain of the wealthy. So the integrity and dignity of the human person is the first concern. So your first concern as a worker isn't how much labor, how much economic output can I get out of this person, but what are the full human needs of this person? And part of their needs is to have a job and to be employed. And so I'm going to meet those needs, but not to such a degree that they are then exploited or the rest of their humanity is ignored. Workers also need religious freedom. So the movement for Sunday to be a day off, and indeed the whole weekend, is a product of the labor movement that the Roman Catholic Church endorses. Moreover, workers should be protected from vices and family separation. So one of the things that happens is people, men in particular, move to mines or factory cities or other outposts of economic production, and factory towns become established where the company owns the housing, the company owns the restaurant, the company owns the saloon, the company owns the brothel, the company owns the sites for gambling. And so what the company does is it creates these opportunities to take money away from workers by encouraging gambling and drinking and prostitution. And so the money doesn't go to family or to better the self. The money actually ends up being dissipated back into the hands of the employer. So that kind of vice needs to be protected against, and the encouragement of religious virtue ought to exist as well. And so families ought to be able to live near the workers. because family life is integral to being a human person. And so, what is the highest duty of an employer? Capitalism says the highest duty of an employer is to make as much profit as possible. Rerum Novarum says no. The highest duty is to give everyone what is just. So the arbitration point isn't profit, but justice. This, again, is a significant aspect of what emerges as Catholic social teaching across the 20th century. And so then to pursue profit or to keep wages low or to exploit workers is a violation of both human law and divine law. People ought to be paid what they're owed and not have their wages kept artificially low so that owners and shareholders can profit more off of them. So in a way, we could see Rerum Novarum as a really radical document that really takes on the problem of capitalism while also trying to protect the faithful from the perils of Marxism or communism. And so what this leads to is to the Roman Catholic Church supporting trade unions, especially Catholic trade unions in Europe, and helping to support social reform and capitalist systems. So the labor movement in the United States becomes heavily Roman Catholic as well as in Europe. And so this also helps create various political parties that actually engage with the liberal democratic experiment that's emerging in places like Germany and Italy in particular, and the creation of parties known as Christian democratic parties. The Christian Democratic Party is still very prominent in places like Germany, for instance. And if you see this title, Christian Democratic, you know that this is a party that was established out of the Roman Catholic labor movement. And these are parties that Leo himself endorses. And so here now we see different responses to modernity by Roman Catholicism. On the one hand, a real suspicion of modernity and how it could undermine the authority of the papacy that we see in the previous reign of Pope Pius IX. And then we see under Leo XIII this endorsement of a critique of modernity and a vision of actually how the church can be involved in social politics in order to further the common good. And this is going to lead, as I said before, to a whole category of ethical teaching known as Catholic social teaching that really comes to full flower with the Second Vatican Council. So that's all for this section. We're going to now move on to talking about the development of missionary activity in this context.